Hello and welcome back to the lineup breakdown analysis of winning lineups, this time for week 16. I am your host, Josh Shepardson, and of course you can follow me on Twitter where I post this at bchad50. And there was no Millionaire Maker this past week at DraftKings. Instead, they held the NFL $4 million main event with a $1 million prize awarded to first place. The field was significantly smaller than that featured in the Millionaire Makers. There were only 2,960 teams. And with a $1,500 buy-in, it's not surprising that the field wasn't super large, didn't need to be to get those large prizes. FanDuel held their normal NFL Sunday Million for Week 16, so the winning lineup, the score, if it seems like it's more in line with the scores that we saw in previous weeks, that's because it is the same contest, same $175,000 prize to first place that was featured last week. These two lineups had four similar players, and by similar I mean four of the same players between the two of them. But there wasn't really any one team that pushed this either GPP winning roster to the top. This isn't a Steelers case of a few weeks ago where one team scored a bunch of points and the GPP rosters featured players from just that team. So without further ado, let's move on to the winning lineup from 159 and 2 in the FanDuel NFL Sunday Million. The team was started off with Carson Palmer at quarterback. He was just 3% owned against the Green Bay Packers, and he really didn't put up a big line. Scored just 17.6 fantasy points. And compared to the fantasy scoring output of quarterbacks of late in these GPP winning lineups, guys like Cam Newton, Russell Wilson, and Ben Roethlisberger, the score was actually fairly low. Not a big showing, just 265 yards passing, passing touchdowns with one interception, and he only had to pass the ball 27 times because this game turned into a blowout, but more on that blowout to come. At running back, really laid the foundation for this team with some big scores. Tim Hightower rushed the ball 27 times for 122 yards and a pair of touchdowns. He also added 47 yards receiving on 3 receptions, and in all, bested 30 fantasy points at just $6,300 and at just a 5.7% ownership rate. Best thing that could have happened for 159 and 2 was Hightower turning in a mediocre effort last week after rushing for a career high 28 times in week 14. Got back to carrying the ball a ton this past week with 27 carries. And people were off of him, didn't use him as much as the week before because he turned in a clunker. And it's great to go back to the well in some instances, and that turned out to be the case here with Tim Hightower. The other back that scored a ton for him was D'Angelo Williams. Chalkier pick at 24.9%, but definitely delivered, scoring by rushing for exactly 100 yards on 17 carries and rushing for 2 scores. Also doing work through the passing game, 6 receptions for 53 yards. And while we've never really seen him as a big receiving threat prior to this year, he's turned into one in this Big Ben-led Steelers offense. Steelers lost this past week, but you certainly can't blame it on D'Angelo Williams. Big effort, over 150 yards from scrimmage, plus those 2 scores. So in all, that backfield accounted for over 60 fantasy points. So really, they were the pillar of this roster. That's to take nothing away from the receivers, though, led by Brandon Marshall. You think the Bears sold low on him and might wish they had him back. He reached 100 receptions in a season for the 6th time in his career with some catches this past weekend. In all, had 8 grabs for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns. And the New York Jets statement win, big win for them over New England. I mean, he's playing like another New York receiver, getting a lot more love, Odell Beckham Jr. And if you just looked at his game logs and did a blind game log test, much like the blind taste test, I think most folks, if you were to say a New York receiver put up these numbers over the last 6 games or so, they'd guess that it was Odell Beckham Jr.'s line, but that's not the case. It's been Brandon Marshall not getting the ownership love of his New York counterpart. Only 3.8% owned over the weekend. Huge game changer for this roster. At that low ownership, the kind of point total that Marshall put up was huge. Opposite him in that matchup was Keyshawn Martin for the New England Patriots, just 1.1% owned and was a punt, $5,400 salary. Reached double digits in fantasy points, and that's about the best thing I can say about Martin's total. The depleted receiving core for New England did result in him catching 7 passes, but turned that into just 68 yards, carried the ball once for 6 yards. Didn't find the end zone, though. Wasn't a big score, but ultimately that salary relief allowed him to spend, allowed 159 and 2 to spend up elsewhere. So there was value in using Martin, but it wasn't for Martin's contributions. Reaching double digits was enough, though, to keep this team from toppling out of the top spot. Allen Robinson did more than just reach double digits, and he was a popular play. 26.7% ownership. Definitely got some buzz going into the weekend because the Saints secondary has just been torched by quarterbacks all year. They've been surprisingly okay against receivers this year. I mean, below average, but they've been beaten more by tight ends and whatnot. But it didn't matter over the weekend. Allen Robinson is an elite receiver, and he's emerged into one in year 2. He's a true wide receiver #1, and I mean, one of the best in the game. He's a touchdown scoring machine, had a 90-yard touchdown grab, and in all, I mean, he torched that New Orleans secondary and scored a total of 24.1 fantasy points, second highest scoring receiver on this team, and joined Brandon Marshall in the 20-plus point receiver group on this team. So definitely kept that momentum up with the running backs and added a formidable score at the receiver position. Tight end didn't really provide much scoring for this winning roster. Will Tye was a popular punt play at just $5,100, 11.9% ownership. With OBJ out, the expectation was somebody's got to step up and catch some passes. Tye had been playing well of late in the second half of the season. Thought was maybe he would pick up some cheap receptions and some cheap points. But sub 5-point fantasy point score did next to nothing. Thankfully for this winner's roster, tight end position really wasn't very fruitful over the weekend. Your big scorer was Jordan Reed, really, and that was in the Thursday night contest, so not part of this main slate. And that ended up being a blessing for this group. And Ty's sub 5-point fantasy point effort didn't derail this winning machine. Kicker and defense were huge for this roster. Blair Walsh scored 23 fantasy points, which is, I mean, if you're getting 10 to 12 fantasy points from your kicker, you're taking that, especially at $4,600, just $100 more than the minimum salary. You're thrilled with that. Blair Walsh doubled that. 23 fantasy points, huge effort. 53-yard long field goal, 5 field goals made in all, 4 made PATs, and actually could have had 24 points if not for a missed PAT. So Walsh, huge effort. Was fairly popular at 9.5% ownership, and I will credit that most likely to the fact that he was just $100 more than the minimum salary. I'm guessing that certainly had something to do with that ownership rate. Finally, the defense that really was huge and helped make up for the quarterback score on this roster was that of the Arizona Cardinals. They went ham this weekend. I mean, they sacked the quarterback, racking up 9 sacks of the Packers, 4 forced turnovers, 2 went for defensive scores, and they only allowed 8 points. So all in all, this was just a monster effort. And because they were facing a Aaron Rodgers-led offense, the odds makers had a small spread in this game. They ended up just 1.1% owned. And I mean, when you can get 33 points from your defense at that kind of an ownership rate, that's the type of game-changing decision that pushes a team to the top of the GPP standings. Moving on to your $1 million winning roster from E. Hafner in the DraftKings NFL $4 million main event. You got another really strong lineup with some diamonds in the rough, but some different pieces here. And before I get any further, I'd also like to point out that E. Hafner finished second in this contest with a different roster, accumulating $1.35 million in winnings just between those 2 spots alone. And as Zach pointed out in the comments of this article that I'm recording the complimentary podcast to. All in all, E. Hafner won nearly $2 million with their entries in this. So big showing for E. Hafner. Just going to analyze their GPP winning lineup, but hat tip to that winner for just crushing the field in this $1,500 buy-in event. Starts at quarterback with Blake Bortles, who certainly outperformed the Carson Palmer score for the FanDuel winning team. Had a big showing with 368 yards passing, 4 passing touchdowns, 2-point conversion, and 5 rushing yards. Did have 2 interceptions, and I mean that pretty much points to what Blake Bortles is, a very good fantasy quarterback, a volume guy, maybe rough around the edges and not necessarily a great NFL quarterback, maybe even below average at this point. But fact is, he gets to air it out to some really talented receivers, Allen Robinson, Allen Hurns, tight end Julius Thomas, and he's made the most of that plus the volume, and you've gotten points from Blake Bortles all year. He continued the trend of quarterbacks torching the New Orleans Saints in a 25.6% ownership. Nobody was sleeping on him in this GPP, and he delivered for those who used him. Doug Martin did not deliver, 18.3% ownership rate. Martin's been one of the league's leading rushers this year, but he lost 2 fumbles, which is really hurt the scoring for him. Did score a touchdown, and but he only totaled 55 yards from scrimmage. In all, only totaled 10.5 fantasy points. Clunker, but with smaller field than your DraftKings Millionaire Makers, didn't end up derailing this roster from a W. Ultimately, with 233.32 points as a whole. D'Angelo Williams carry over from the other roster. Big showing, even more valuable at DraftKings with the 100-yard rushing bonus and the full point per reception. 20.7% chalky ownership, as the ownership rate indicates, but one of the better performers this weekend, and definitely a big one for this team. Brandon Marshall, another carryover, but also like in the FanDuel NFL Sunday Million, low owned, 4.3% ownership rate, real game changer, like D'Angelo Williams, also more valuable at DraftKings than at FanDuel because of the full point per reception, plus that yardage bonus. Player that was different on this roster than the other one was Ruben Randall, who made for a very viable punt at 3,500, 20.5% ownership in this tournament. Had a lot of owners frustrated with him for almost the entirety of that Giants game, but he did reel in a garbage time 72-yard touchdown reception near the end of the third quarter, saved his day ultimately, and ended up obviously paying off his salary of just $3,500, which is just $500 above the minimum salary for receivers. Scored 16 points. That's good enough at $3,500. Allen Robinson bested 30 fantasy points on DraftKings. Another carryover from the other winning roster that was analyzed, and like the other 2 that were discussed, also a beneficiary of the yardage bonus, besting 100 yards receiving, and the full point per reception with 6 of them. Tight end was a position that differed on this roster, and hit on one of the better tight end performances over the weekend. Travis Kelce didn't put in a huge effort, but 6 receptions for 46 yards and a touchdown, was better than most of his counterparts at the position, and basically illustrated that Travis Kelce can play. I mean, he finds the end zone, doesn't get enough targets, doesn't get enough usage. The guy's talented, and he's always in play in GPPs. He squandered some really good opportunities this year, but he's also played well in some matchups that weren't plus matchups. So Kelce's a bit maddening to use in DFS, a bit maddening to own in season-long leagues, but this is what he can do. I mean, he can give you that touchdown and 40-plus receiving yards on, a half dozen grabs like he did in this contest any given week, regardless of the defense. Of course, he can also give you some clunkers when Alex Smith only attempts 20 passes and half of them end up in Jeremy Maclin's direction. But moving on to the flex, Javarius Buck Allen, $4,200, 2.2% ownership, and this took some guts to roll out Allen, facing a tough Steelers defense against the run, facing a big favorite Steelers team that ended up losing outright. But most importantly, that doghouse, going to get back to that. He actually played fewer snaps than Terrence West in week 15. So you really had to have some faith in Allen getting out of the doghouse, getting some more developmental reps in a lost season for the Ravens. Makes sense that he played more this past week, and that John Harbaugh forgave the fumble from the week before. I'm guessing that E. Hafner was probably expecting some cheap points in the passing game since this was a double-digit point spread, and Allen is a very talented pass catcher. Didn't really end up working out that way. Was more of a balanced line from Allen because the Ravens were in a position to salt away the game. Allen rushed for 79 yards, which is pretty impressive against just 18 carries against a stout run defense, and did add a touchdown. But he also chipped in as a pass catcher, which, like I said, I think this is where Al Hafner was actually expecting, or E. Hafner was expecting some scoring from Allen. 5 receptions for 35 yards, and that's 8.5 points. It's definitely got some value for a $4,200 option. All in all, more than 20 points from your flex position at that salary and that low ownership rate. Turned out to be a nice bargain pick and a game changer for this roster. And finally, the Arizona Cardinals defense. I mean, there's not much more to say about their performance, but I will point out that they were just 0.1%, not 1.1 like in the FanDuel NFL Sunday Million, 0.1% owned. And so that 33 fantasy points that they were worth on both sites was all the more valuable in this tournament, with essentially next to no one but E. Hafner owning them in this GPP. And with that, that's going to wrap things up for this week's lineup breakdown, analysis of the winning lineups for Week 16. Check out dailyfantasycafe.com for our video podcasts, articles, active forum, and our tools that are there to help you win big like these big winners this week and pile up some DFS winnings. So till next week, good luck.